Influence can be defined simply as the ability to move a person or persons to a desired action, usually within the context of a specific goal. The essence of influence is pull. Great influencers don't push. Great influencers attract people, first to themselves and only then to their ideas. Nobody's going to follow you because you have a certain goal. They're going to follow you because they believe there is a vested interest for them in doing so. Now, that interest is they feel you cause them to feel good about themselves. Great leadership is always about the other person. It's about the value that you're adding to another person's life.
Welcome back to another episode of Growth Unlocked. I'm your host, Kieran Krohn. Most leaders are trained to manage people, but not to move them. In today's world of distributed teams, shifting priorities, and low trust, influence without authority becomes the number one leadership skill that nobody actually teaches. Today, I'm really lucky to be joined by Bob Burg, bestselling author of The Go-Giver and one of the world's top voices on genuine influence. We'll unpack how modern leaders win hearts, build buy-in, and lead through presence, not power. Bob, thanks a lot for joining us.
My pleasure, Karen. Thank you so much for having me.
Let's do it. So, Bob, most leaders are taught how to build strategy and hit targets, but almost none of them, I think, are formally taught how to influence. Why do you think that influence is the most overlooked and arguably most important leadership skill?
First, let's look at what influence really is, because that's a great question, and we need to really explore what it is and what it isn't in order to see why it is so important and so powerful. So, on a very basic level, Kieran, influence can be defined simply as the ability to move a person or persons to a desired action, usually within the context of a specific goal. Okay, again, very basic definition. That is what influence is. Now, that's the definition, but that's not necessarily its, as my co-author John David Mann calls it, its substance, right? Or essence. The essence of influence, when done correctly, what John and I call genuine influence. The essence of influence is pull. Pull as opposed to push. As in the old saying, how far can you push a rope? And the answer is not very, at least not very fast or very effectively, right? Which is why great leaders, great influencers don't push. They don't push themselves. They don't push their ideas. They don't push their will on others. They're not push-y, right? You never hear people say, wow, that Dave or that Susan, she is so influential. She has a lot of push with people, right? No, she's influential. She has a lot of pull with people. And that's what influence is. It's pull. It's an attraction. Great influencers attract people, right? First to themselves and only then to their ideas. Now, why is this important? Because if you can't move people to accept and act upon your ideas, you're simply not able to add value to the marketplace, right? So the question then goes, well, okay, so this pull, how does it occur, right? How does a genuine influencer create this pull in order to influence, to move people to action? And they do it through understanding that while you need to be internally motivated, you need to be outwardly focused and make it about them. Why? Because, and Dale Carnegie taught us this almost 100 years ago through his classic How to Win Friends and Influence People, when he said, ultimately, people do things for their reasons, not our reasons. Now, don't get me wrong. You can try and influence through compliance, right? Through force or through threat of force. You're fired if you don't do this, right? Or you're not going to advance if you don't do this, or or however you want to do it. Sure, you can do it, and sometimes it will work, at least for a little while. But typically, when you try to influence through compliance, which again is push, that person's not going to be engaged. They're going to do maybe what you tell them to do, but that's it, right? And they'll often sabotage the situation anyway, whether consciously or unconsciously. It's very difficult to sustain influence through push. Okay, so we need to make it about the other person, and so the great influencer, the genuine influencer, is always asking themselves questions, and that is such as, how does what I'm asking this person to do, how does it align with their goals, with their needs, with their wants, with their desires? How does it align with their values? How does what I want this other person to do, how does it help solve a problem for them? How does it help move them closer to happiness? And when we ask ourselves these questions, Kieran, um, thoughtfully, intelligently, genuinely, authentically, not as a way to manipulate another human being into doing our will, right? But as a way of building everyone in the process, now we've come a lot closer to earning that person's commitment, okay, to what we're asking them to do. Now, one of my great mentors, her name is Dondi Scumaci. She teaches leaders and influencers all over the world, some of the biggest companies. And what she says is, when it comes to leadership, when it comes to influence, compliance or push, right? Compliance will never take you where commitment or pull can go. I think that's why it's so important. Because if you want sustainable long-term influence, right, you've got to do it in such a way that you attain people's buy-in.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely right. Because at the end of the day, like great leaders are, you know, you're getting people to rally behind them and the vision in terms of where they're going in the future. And I guess like you need to be able to uh, have people in the long term. You don't want people just coming and going and looking at things superficially. But if you're trying to build something great, that takes a lot of time, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd say it takes more time if you try to do it through push, because you're always going to be stopping and starting and stopping and starting. I don't think anything good comes instantly necessarily. So when we say it takes time, I think anything good does take time to develop, but it doesn't have to take more time than it should. And I think you're going to actually cut the time down when you've got people who are committed to, attaining the same goal.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess it makes me think then, Bob, like on the inverse of that, people that do it well, like what are the biggest mistakes that you see leaders making that are actually going to kill an influence, um, before they even realize what they're doing?
I think it all comes down to the leader thinking it's about them. And this is the biggest mistake you make. If we can put this in the sales vernacular for a moment, and then we'll bring it back to leadership. I used to, when I would speak at sales conferences all over, I'd often start out by saying, nobody's going to buy from you because you have a quota to meet. Okay, they're not going to buy from you because you need the money or you have a sales goal or even because you're a nice human being. They're going to buy from you because they believe that ultimately they will be better off by doing so than by not doing so. Right? Human nature. Same with leadership. Nobody's going to follow you because you have a certain goal. Right? They're not going to follow you because you would like to accomplish this. They're not going to follow. Now, don't get me wrong. Doesn't mean you don't have goals. Doesn't mean you don't want to accomplish it. Of course, all those things. I'm just saying that's not why they're going to follow you. They're going to follow you because they believe there is a vested interest for them in doing so. Now, that interest is they feel you cause them to feel good about themselves. They feel as though you care about them, right? And when I say feel, I mean, they're correct in that, that you actually do, right? They feel that by being part of this organization, they are going to get fed what they need, aside from just the money. Don't get me wrong, the salary, money, payment, that's always important. But once that basic part is covered, okay, After that, money becomes very low on the totem pole as to why people will feel engaged in an organization and why they will follow a leader. It's much more emotional than that.
Mm. I can relate to this, Bob, in the sense that so I was at HubSpot for 8 years, and 5.5 years I was an individual contributor. For 2 years I was a sales leader, right? And I think about this a lot in terms of the fact that, you know, there was a couple of months when I was giving a bit of mentoring and some guidance, and like my boss was great. Don't get me wrong; she was like excellent to work with and work for, but I don't feel like I was ever really kind of given this insight or taught about this concept of like how to lead with influence.
Mm.
I mean, there's a bunch of authors that I learned from. Like I think Brene Brown's got some pretty amazing thoughts on the topic, but why is it that, firstly, businesses don't teach people that are moving into the world, like to go from being an individual contributor to a leader? That's a huge jump, right? It's not just like getting a promotion in line with, the role that you're doing at that point in time. It's a massive step up. And I don't think that all people are necessarily suited to be in leadership in the first place, right? So, like, talk to me about that, Bob. Like, why do you think that, big companies with huge budgets that have got some pretty smart people running them haven't really thought about fixing this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things in leadership that while they're getting better in many ways, it hasn't progressed as much as we would think it should, especially with all the great information out there. In terms of leadership, and with all the great leaders who have led fantastic organizations and then have written about it, who teach it, who and so forth. I mean, the information's out there, and when people think, well, but people who I employ, they're just working for the money and that's it. No, that's been proven that that attitude is not the most profitable attitude for your company. People are people, and the and people do have people who are, well. Let's put it this way: there's a study, a series of studies, what have you, and I don't know if this figure is totally true or not. Okay, I suspect it's close, and many leaders I've spoken to have said yes, it's pretty much right on the mark. But again, I don't know, because sometimes you read these studies. Well, how did they exactly, right? But it's that 75% of the corporate workplace feels disengaged. Now, that's what a horrible number that is. Again, I don't know if it's true, but probably close. And there's no reason for that. There's just too many people out there. There's people like Bob Chapman, who wrote Everybody Matters, who took a company, a huge Barry Waymiller, a huge manufacturing firm, and took this to great heights through investing time and energy. And I'll just say it, love, right into his company, and making people just feel good about being part of that entire mission. And we're talking about a manufacturing company. These are commodities. It doesn't matter, right? There's people like Stephen M.R. Covey, son of Dr. Stephen Covey, who wrote Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. Stephen M.R. Covey, who wrote uh, The Speed of Trust, and who his latest book, Trust and Inspire. Sorry, I couldn't remember the title for a quick moment. Trust and Inspire. Who has proven, Stephen in his case, through first leading a huge organization, but then writing about it, who's shown that the command and control type of, well, these are my employees, tell them what to do. They do. It shows that is not nearly as productive and or profitable, okay, as when you build your people. Uh, it just, so what can you say? Why is this not something that every major company has understood and embraced? I guess, as Jim Rohn, the great speaker and philosopher, used to say, I don't know. They just don't. It's one of those mysteries of life. Because the information is certainly out there.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, it seems a bit bonkers, isn't it, when, it's all out there for everyone to get access to, but for some reason it's just not common practice. which I think is absolute madness, right? And when you think about the cost to hire new people, how much that eats into profit margins, how much that impacts customer experience. When you have a revolving door, people are leaving the business if they're not hanging around for long enough, particularly in sales, right? Because the time that it takes for a salesperson to ramp up to full productivity, if you're losing that person before that time is hit or just soon after, I mean, the
Very
whole
common.
business model is just going to start to break down, right?
Mhm. Oh, sure, sure, absolutely. No,
Mm.
you're totally spot on.
And so, most execs, I think, in general, know how to build strategy, right? But how do you build emotional buy-in, especially when the stakes can be really high or when the direction might be unpopular?
Well, I mean, when it can be unpopular, that it does eventually come down to a leader has to lead. So culture comes from the top and it trickles down. Don't get me wrong, you can lead from wherever you are in an organization. Stephen M. R. Covey talks about that. Mark Sanborn talks about that. Robin Sharma talks about that. Leading without a title and so forth. Absolutely. And in your area, the team you're whatever, sure, you can do that, and hopefully it catches on and the word gets around about why this particular part is so profitable and engaged, and there's little turnover, and then from upstairs they say, oh well, let's learn more about that. Does that always happen? Certainly not. Okay. And that's why I say the actual culture is formed at the top. Okay. And so that needs to be bought in. Now, when a leader has ideas that aren't popular, well, okay, so how do you take those ideas and make them popular? I mean, I think you frame them in a way that people see why it's an advantage to them to buy into that. David Marquette, who wrote the book "Turn Your Ship Around," who was a commander in the Navy. It was a Navy captain who had a nuclear submarine. It was the worst performing one in the Navy. Within a few years, he turned it around to be one of the highest performing ones. And he went little by little. He went and tried to understand what was it that those on the team were not receiving from leadership that they needed. How could he make his goals their goals, and how could he determine, just as we were discussing before. And he said something really interesting. He said, he said that magic point is 10%. He said, once you've got 10% of the people who are buying, that's the toughest part, to get that initial 10%. But once you get that, now you're at a point where it can start to spread. Why? Because now you've got these 10%, many of them who become your walking ambassadors, and people who they themselves have influence with others. So again, it's not something that you can do through fiat, through edict. You can't say, this is what we're doing, we're changing this, the company culture is now this, we're going to put some signs up there with some catchy slogans, and that's going to be it. No, it doesn't work like that. You've got to go through the effort of understanding your people and understanding what is going to motivate them. What is it that they care about? Sometimes, by the way, you won't be able to do that with certain people, and they're going to, need to find another organization to work in. Some people is just, as Jim Collins, Good to Great, would talk about, they're just on the wrong seat, right? And so you need to find another one that's more. But by and large, you're going to do it through tapping in to your organization and seeing them as human beings who they themselves have needs, wants, desires, goals, problems, challenges, and are looking to be part of something bigger than themselves.
Mm. Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, something that just sprung to mind, Bob, that I used to try practice when I was a leader was, particularly in sales, is it's often really common for a company to, firstly set a quota for their reps, right? That just naturally has to happen because they've got to hit a number to the street
Sure.
if they're publicly listed. There's a buffer in there, but often like the expectations that are set from an activity perspective around the amount of calls you need to make, emails, meetings, pipeline you have to create are typically tied to that quota that's set by the company, right? And that's all well and good to give people a bit of direction and help them to know what they need to do on a sort of daily, weekly, monthly basis to achieve the end result, right? But one thing that I found to be more effective is engineering or reverse engineering their daily, weekly, monthly metrics that are actually based off what's important to them, which, if you spend the time to understand it, is that person motivated by, do they want to start to save to go on a holiday to Europe? Do they want to save to buy a house? Like, are they looking to support the lifestyle that they have? And that's something that I think like more companies could do in terms of kind of really upfront spending the time to really understand like what is firstly the thing that motivates that individual, and then how do I make their numbers about them as opposed to about the company.
Yeah. So I love that. One of my to me, one of the greatest leaders is a guy named Jeff West, who most people haven't heard of other than in the sales and insurance profession. He was a huge producer and then state sales coordinator with Aflac years ago, for many years actually. And that's just what Jeff did. Jeff would coach he first, when he was smaller and just coming up, he was coaching his individual salespeople. Then, of course, he was coaching his leaders how to coach their salespeople, and then he was coaching their leaders how to coach his leaders how to coach their leaders how to coach their leaders, and he did a magnificent job of teaching how to tie in to that salesperson's, again, needs, wants, desires, goals, problems, and pursuit of happiness. It all comes down to that. Now, of course, the salesperson always needs to know, if they're going to sell successfully, that they need to know how to tap into the needs, wants, desires, problems, challenges, and pursuit of happiness of their prospective customer or client. So isn't it interesting how it all goes toward that? And again, there's nothing self-sacrificial about this. It's understanding, though, that the more you focus on yourself, the less effective you're going to be. The more you focus on those who you are accountable to and accountable for, right? The more buy-in you are going to attain from them.
Mm. It makes me think how important it is as whether you're a salesperson or work in customer success, whatever kind of function you are, if you're customer facing and at the coal face having conversations with prospects, customers, and partners, especially if it's a meeting for the first time or even for the 10th time, how important it is to prepare for that meeting, right? Because there's so much information out there that exists that can be scraped through tools. AI does a great job at this now in terms of reading what's in your inbox, taking any information from LinkedIn, from search, engines like Perplexity, etc., and then basically preparing a really concise summary about who that person is, what they're probably going to be interested in based off their role, based off their company, based off their history. All this kind of rich information is out there. And I feel like a lot of salespeople, the really good ones, they spend the time to actually do that preparation. But, there's a massive opportunity for companies to leverage AI and this kind of technology to take care of a lot of that preparation, right? Because, it only really takes a couple of minutes in the beginning to really frame that conversation to show that you actually are invested in knowing who they are, what's important to them, that I think like really can move the needle in having those conversations.
Kieran, there is today no excuse for not doing research and discovering well before the conversation so much of what can help you during that conversation. One of the things in the States that we make fun of is, when we say the term, when I was a kid, and then we talk about, how difficult, I don't know if you have that, in the beautiful land down under or not, but it's a kind of a saying here. When I was a kid, we used to, right? We had to, well, I'm just going to say this. I'm 67. When I was a kid, and I needed to find information on something. Okay, my dad would say, "Go to the library and find it out." Now, for those who don't know what a library is, right? It's this big building that had a lot of books, and you could actually research stuff. We actually had to do that back in the day. And even when I first started in business, if I was, if I had a sale that I was working on and I needed to research this, I went to the library and you had to go through this microfiche and find out about these. But now it's a tap. And now, as you said, it's even easier now with AI. Um, so no excuse for for not doing our research and learning as much as we can about what will help us to tap into that person's world
Hmm.
and serve them.
Yeah,
And again, just
absolutely.
like as John David Mann and I talk about in all the books on the Go Giver series, that the basic premise is that shifting your focus, and this is the key, shifting your focus from getting to giving. In this case, giving simply means constantly and consistently providing value to others. And value can be learning about that person so that you know how to best serve them, right? Not only is it a more fulfilling way of conducting business, it is the most financially profitable way as well.
Mm, I hear you for sure. Bob, I guess looking back on your career, can you think of or share a moment where the five laws of stratospheric success showed up for you, and sort of how did that experience maybe reshape your view on what real value creation actually looks like?
Well, I mean, the five laws, which are the laws of value, compensation, influence, authenticity, and receptivity, uh, they have to show up all the time. It's how a sustainable business is built and created and sustained. Um, but I think the biggest thing for me was when a mentor at a sales organization I was with said, Bob, if you want to make a lot of money in sales, and we can replace sales with business leadership, what have you. But he said, if you want to make a lot of money in sales, he said, don't have making money as your target. Your target, he said, is serving others. Now, when you hit the target, he said, you'll get a reward, and that reward will come in the form of money. And you can do with that money whatever you choose. But never forget, he said, the money is simply the reward for hitting the target. It's not the target itself. Your target is serving others. And, Karen, what that said to me was great salesmanship, or we could say great leadership, what have you, is never about the salesperson or about the leader, right? Great salesmanship is never about the product or service. As important as the product and service is, which it is, it's never what it's about. Great salesmanship, great leadership is always about the other person. It's about the value that you're adding to another person's life. Or we could say this, it's about another person's life being better just because you are part of it. And I think that when we approach sales, leadership, influence, what have you, from that foundational premise, I think we're really 9 steps ahead of the game in a 10-step game.
Love it. Well, I guess thinking ahead to the future, like if the next generation of leaders could actually master the art of influence without authority, what kind of organizations and world do you think we would create?
I don't know that it's, and this might be just my lack of foresight, but I don't see that it necessarily has to be a different type of creation in terms of an organization. I mean, an organization is an organization. It can be run, business can be conducted, differently. But I mean, I think it's where there's genuine caring about each other. And again, that doesn't mean you're not really family. You don't love each other as much as you love your family. But you still respect each other. You care for each other. You care about each other, right? There's honesty within the organization. You care enough to speak the truth, and the truth is encouraged. Ray Dalio talks about this in his excellent book, Principles. Now, you do it respectfully, you do it tactfully and diplomatically, but you share the truth. You care enough about each other to share the truth. And everyone is held accountable. I think what it comes down to, and again, my friend Jeff West, who's now an author, he and I wrote a book called Streetwise to Saleswise, Become Objection Proof and Beat the Sales Blues. And again, Jeff is such a magnificent leader. And Jeff says, in the best organizations, the person who on top, the leader, his or her position is actually head servant. You know, and I think when we keep that in mind, that's pretty much the organization I think most people want to be part of.
Well said. Absolutely. Bob, really appreciate your time today. Thank you for all the insights. And like I said before the conversation, I do feel like if more people could read your books and take a page out of that, the world would honestly be a much better place.
Wow. Well, I tell you, it means a lot to me, and I appreciate you, Karen, and all the work you're doing. So keep up the great work, my friend.
Awesome. Bob, if people wanted to follow along or learn more about you, what's the best place for them to do that?
Yeah, they can go to burg.com, and pretty much everything's there. They can read chapters of any of the books. They can subscribe to my Daily Impact e-newsletter if they'd like. So it's all right there at burg.com.
Amazing. Thanks again, Bob. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Growth Unlocked Beyond Scale. If you enjoyed the show, it would really be appreciated if you can leave a 5-star review wherever you consume your podcasts. And while you're there, why not subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future episodes? If you'd like to learn about how to drive profitable scale in your business, gain clarity on your direction, and improve your business valuation, click the link in the show notes to connect with Kieran.